Hey, y'all, welcome back to the podcast. On this episode, we have on Mr. Peter Pfeiffer, the architect, for a third time. There are just so many topics that we've wanted to cover with him, and so we're breaking it up into a few different episodes. We actually recorded this episode a few weeks ago. I can't believe how much time's passed, so sorry for the delay on getting this episode out, but this one is on modern houses. It's a trend that's really popped up all over the country, and Austin has a ton of them. They're beautiful, but they're also complex and come with a lot of building science issues that have to be addressed and whatnot. And so we dove into modern houses and kind of tore them apart, honestly, but it was a good conversation. Hope y'all enjoy. Again, Peter, for joining us. 3 for 3. This is pretty great.
Well, I am Peter Pfeiffer still.
You are Peter Pfeiffer.
I haven't changed my name, and I'm still with Barley Pfeiffer Architecture here in Austin, Texas.
Consistency, I like it.
Yes.
Well, today we had you back because I want to roast modern houses.
Oh, you do? You didn't tell me that earlier, but this sounds fun.
As a builder, they make my hair stand up when I see a modern house with no overhangs and a black roof and some dark stucco, and your name starts rattling in the back of my head when I see plans for a house like that. And I know there's a way that it can properly be done, and I would say that 99% of the ones in Austin most likely are not built correctly. And modern homes, although from my opinion look great on day one, by about day 365 they start looking pretty bad. And so I'd love to kind of dive down the modern home rabbit hole with you.
Well, let's do that, but I hope I'm okay with using my cynical term for many of them. And it's not at all meant to be anything other than just to make a point, but we call them bikini boxes. Do you know why?
I don't know if I fully understand the saying there.
They start off being a very attractive looking home, especially the ones that are stucco and natural wood and a flat roof and floor to ceiling windows. They do look attractive. I understand it. But then they become a high maintenance. And the analogy, of course, is did you choose your spouse or your partner based entirely on how they look in a bathing suit? And I'd like to think not. Mm-hmm. That there's other things to long-term relationships than just how they look on day one, all gussied up. Mm-hmm. We need to look at the homes we build from the perspective that they're going to last hopefully more than 25 years before they need thousands upon thousands of dollars of maintenance. We try to design homes that are going to be around a century. We call them century homes. And we therefore make design decisions with that in mind, performance as well as looks. You were talking about how they may not look good over time. We lost the opportunity to design a very handsome home on Lake Austin about 7 years ago. They hired a well-established architectural firm from Connecticut to do this house on Lake Austin. And I had mentioned in our interview that we really do try to specify our materials and do our designs to reflect what is going to be a very harsh environment they have perched up on a cliffside overlooking Lake Austin, facing into the afternoon sun and the direction that the storm winds come from. And sure enough, in less than 7 years, they've built scaffolding all around their building, and they're completely reskinning it now with something that will handle that the heat and handle the storms, and replacing windows and actually doing some things to protect the windows.
Let me guess, no overhangs?
No overhangs.
Smooth, flat walls.
White stucco box with redwood accents. Mm-hmm. And it literally, we watched it from the boat. We have a boat on Lake Austin. Over the years, it went from being beautiful to 1 year later looking still okay to 7 years later looking like it was 55 years old. Mm-hmm. And that's, you have to own your decisions. And if you, as an architect or as a homeowner, want something that is not going to hold up to the climate, you have to say to yourself, okay, am I ready to put $20, $30, $50, $100,000 into this building every 5 to 10 years? And the answer, I bet you, is no. Mm-hmm. I bet you the answer is no. But I'm here today to maybe talk about what you could do. We've got this modern homes tour that probably by the time this podcast airs will be over with. Nonetheless, I think
So that's an AIA. Sorry to cut you off, but that's an AIA home tour.
no, it's not an AIA home tour. It's actually put on this group called the Modern Home Tour.
Oh, interesting.
It's a national group. We've been nice that we've had a home chosen for it every single year for about 17 years.
Wow.
And the home we have this year is in the Northwest Hills area of Austin, not too far from your office is for us. But it's unlike most of the other homes on the tour, it does have broad overhangs and awnings to protect the windows and the doors. We did design it to respond to our hotter and even hotter summers and make it so that you could be comfortable inside this house without having to close the blinds and turn the AC way down. My partner actually came up with a term for that. We made it so that you would have benign temperature zones, meaning you could read a book in the family room of this house at 5 o'clock on a July afternoon and not have to close the blinds because there's so much glare and heat, but be very comfortable and enjoy being bathed in reflected natural light, not direct solar radiation. That's probably about the biggest thing is controlling solar radiation is the number one thing you should be able to expect your architect to do for you when they come up with a design for a home in a air-conditioned dominated climate like Austin is.
And a lot of modern homes, typically you see a lot of flat roofs, or very low-pitched roofs. What are you doing on those? I mean, are you still doing flat roofs or?
We judiciously, because remember I think I've talked to you before about the two very distinctive types of flat roofs.
I don't know if we've done it on the podcast.
Yeah, there's two.
Okay.
There's the ones that don't leak and the ones that don't leak yet.
Yeah, exactly.
So you have two types. And I know that's tongue-in-cheek. And I know someone's going to say, oh, the materials are so much better than they were in the 60s and 70s and 80s. I don't know, guys. If you flip a bird at nature, nature's going to win. Nature always wins. Physics always wins. The reason why a sloped roof is so much more reliable over time is that you could even get a few nail holes in a sloped roof, but in most cases, the water will run right by it. Mm-hmm. I actually saw this happen with the building we have our offices in on 6th Street. It has a metal roof, original metal roof. The building was built in 1910. Wow. It did have some pinhole leaks and some nail hole size leaks in it. I remember being in the attic checking on something when I noticed it started raining really hard and I could see the daylight and the water just went right by it.
Oh, you were standing inside looking through the metal roof?
Yeah. Because, if there's velocity behind the water, it's not necessarily going to want to just come squirming right through that hole. Mm-hmm. But if that had been a flat roof, it would have definitely been something like more than just a trickle of water staining the ceiling and ruining our building. Mm-hmm. Yeah, flat roofs are not going to last forever. You have to be prepared to maintain them and inspect them regularly, like every few years. It's just not wise.
When you do spec one, are you doing like your TPO system? Or
yes, we're doing a TPO system, and we're doing them very judiciously. Mm-hmm. I even have one section of one of my buildings with a small flat roof, but boy, we tried and tried and tried to design some type of sloped roof everywhere we could. But to do an entire house with a flat roof or even a slightly sloped roof, you're just flirting with large maintenance costs for the rest of your life. Mm-hmm. The problem with flat roofs also that a lot of my colleagues don't quite get is that there is something good to be said about having an attic. There are a few things that are good to be said. When you've got a sloped roof, and I hope you guys can see me on this when I hold my hands like this, you can do the roof in such a way that it's not just adhered to the decking, but that there's an airspace between it and the decking so that it can act like a radiation barrier. And that gets into some details that we'd have to talk about later if we have the time to. But the other thing about having an attic is it gives you a logical way of running your air conditioning ducts.
True. Yeah.
And if you don't have an attic, then you're trying to squeeze the duct into this little soffit or that little fur down, and you end up usually with leakier ducts and a not so efficient duct layout. The less efficient the air conditioning ducts are laid out, either the more energy it's going to take to blow air through them, or thus the less comfortable the space will be because you don't get really good airflow. You just have to buy into the fact that I don't think we're going to see another ice age in our lifetime. But I'm quite sure we're going to see the summers getting warmer and warmer and warmer and warmer. And you have to start making design decisions that reflect that reality.
Absolutely.
And we can talk about some of those design decisions if you want, and talk about the humidity issues that also come about from when you don't have good protection of the house.
I think we should dive into the humidity one because that's always been fascinating to me. And I've heard you talk, porous surfaces like natural woods or stone can really kind of hold and absorb water. But what are your favorite exterior surfaces? Like what's the most ideal one that you spec into your homes?
We've done a lot of homes with metal siding, but you have to buy into that aesthetic. But the combination of metal siding with a synthetic siding like this hardy panel, especially if you're going to use hardy panel, get the material that's pre-primed and then paint it well. What you want from a larger perspective is a cladding of your building that sheds water well. It's just like the analogy I've used before. Do to your building what you do to yourself out in nature. If you are standing out in a rainstorm with a cotton blazer on, you would get sopping wet. Mm-hmm. But if you had a rain slicker on where the water just ran off the skin of it, you would be much more comfortable and protected. So therefore, think twice about doing exterior building materials that absorb water. What are those? Brick, stone, stucco, and natural wood. We almost don't do any of those materials in our homes anymore because unless they're really well painted, unless the stucco has what's called, some type of good exterior paint, elastomeric paint, there's a good chance that it's going to absorb moisture. Same with stone, same with brick, unless the brick's really well painted. And same with natural wood. Even if the natural wood is treated, eventually the treatment wears off and the wood becomes an absorber of moisture. And if you have this wet, sopping cladding system around you after a rainstorm, or even just after a very drizzly day or moist day, where do you think that moisture goes?
Pushes into the house.
Why do you think it pushes into the house, young Matt?
Something that I don't fully, I feel like I somewhat understand the principles behind, but vapor drive.
That's right.
And that's one that I still feel like confuses me a little bit. But
grasshopper, you're right. I'm just playing.
But
with
I've heard
you
of like there's a I remember seeing years ago when I was still at the build show, this builder, I can't remember where he was, but he had a vapor closed wallpaper on the interior of his wall that he didn't realize, and it was doing vapor was driving through that wall system and getting stopped at the wallpaper. When you peeled it off the wall, it was just covered in mold. And that was the first time that like the light bulb kind of clicked for me, and I started to understand it a bit more.
Right, and that actually brings up another subject that we will touch on, which is the dangers of air conditioning your house too cold.
Interesting.
If you air condition your home below the mid-70s, like 74 degrees, 75 degrees, unless it's a very specially built house, you are setting up the conditions for mold and mildew to propagate inside your walls. I think the dog just agreed with me on that.
Before we dive into that one, and we get off this topic of the...
But I was going to talk about vapor drive.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely want to get back into that. But the exterior cladding materials, I had a question that came to mind. The popularization of rain screens, has that affected the way that you spec materials? I mean, are you more likely to do a wood siding knowing that there's a rain screen behind it?
The rain screen does help, without a doubt. But the natural wood siding still is going to look old and haggard in a few years. Mm-hmm. So, yes, a rain screen, which is essentially you're creating a gap between the back side of the siding and the house is weather wrap. It'll help because if the siding gets wet and the sun comes out and heats up that siding and that humidity starts wanting to come towards the house, it doesn't dry out. Humidity goes where nature tells it to go, and everything in nature goes from wet to dry and from warm to cold. Well, it's drier and cooler inside the house probably. So that's what we mean by a vapor drive, driving that wet stones moisture or that wet sidings moisture into the house. Now, if there's an airspace that interrupts it, that's great. Ideally, it will condense and drop down and drain out. That's ideally. If everything's built right, it will be less of a problem. But you still have this issue of the siding not looking good over time because it just doesn't hold up to the sun very well. And then you still have the issue of brick and stone and even stucco getting mildew on them and requiring someone to power wash your house more regularly than if you just used the right materials that shed water in the first place. Mm-hmm. And that's just it. You can do anything you want. It's just a matter of how much money do you want to put into maintaining your house for the rest of your life.
I feel like some people, I mean, when you get into the really high-end custom homes, are like, I don't care. They care, number one is aesthetic, and you can tell them a million times this is going to be a maintenance nightmare, and they're just like, have you ran into those clients before?
Sure, yeah. That's right.
I have a few right now.
if they've got the budget to spend $25,000 a year maintaining their house, and there are people who are successful enough that that's probably no issue.
Yeah.
Do it. But, you know, the older I get, the more I like the idea of designing homes for people who aren't so well-heeled. We love designing fancy homes, don't get me wrong. We've got 2 or 3 running through the office. That's just so much fun. But that's not really moving the sustainability needle. And I think if we want to live a more secure life, we have to think about how much are we affecting the environment because of our home design choices? How much are we affecting global security? I mean, let's call a spade a spade. The more stuff you consume, the more we have to, as a country, provide you. And that doesn't come for free. Yes, you can do a house that that consumes $2,000 a month in electricity because you're air conditioning it so much. But who's really paying for that? Are you just paying for that? No, there is a societal cost to that. Mm-hmm. There is some carbon that goes into the atmosphere, probably in the manufacturing of the energy that house is using. There is air conditioning leakage going on. We all do pay a price for excessive consumption of stuff, of energy included. And that could take us down a certain rabbit hole that maybe we don't need to. But ideally, I like designing homes that won't take an arm or a leg to maintain and to operate, and then can be very comfortable and relatively low maintenance. Mm-hmm. That's, I think, the higher level of doing a house.
I absolutely agree, and I think that I learned that was really eye-opening to me when I was in the roofing business for a little bit with Forrest, and you start looking at the differences between an asphalt shingle roof versus metal, and even though the cost of metal is 2x, maybe 2.5x. Those asphalt shingles don't really decompose. They take hundreds of years. You're going to have to replace it here in a few years. And so it's like you spend more money up front, but you get a roof system that lasts significantly longer. Plus, you're not filling up the landfill with all of these asphalt shingles. And that was one that was like very eye-opening to me, just to realize how much waste there are just in roofing. And then you can, put that across the rest of the house. And in every category, there's, examples like that.
Well, that's how the green building movement started. We were dealing very effectively with managing the demand of electricity in Austin back in the mid-'80s. And then we got very good about managing the demand for water by helping people realize that if you use drought-tolerant landscaping, you'll save significantly on your water bill, and we may not have to build that new water treatment plant that ended up getting built out on Lake Travis, but we were able to put off the need for it for a good decade by getting people to use less water on their lawns. But then along came this issue of how are we going to manage the massive amount of garbage ending up in our landfills? And that's when we realized that that almost 50% of it was coming from the construction trades. Just like you said, you replace your roof and you rip off those shingles, there's a dump truck or two of stuff that ends up in the landfill every 15 years, 20 years, when you've got what we call a temporary shingle roof, and we call them temporary roofs because they are.
Well, here in Texas with hail, you're probably doing that every 5.
Whereas if you do a good metal roof that's got a class 4 hail rating, and it's ideally got some striations in the panels between the ribs, that'll last a century easily.
Absolutely.
But the other difference is that roof, the metal roof that is the right finish, galvalume finish, kind of a silvery finish, will not only last a century, but it'll look better over time. It'll develop a nice patina. It won't look old. And it'll make your house much more comfortable and probably save on your air conditioning bills the equivalent of $30,000 worth of solar panels. So and it'll save you insurance costs too. And it'll make the house more fire resistant. So there's all sorts of reasons to build with the proper roofs, not just the environmental reasons of reducing the amount of trash that ends up in a landfill.
Absolutely.
But it's like everything else. You need to make informed decisions, and you probably need to open up your pocketbook a little bit more to buy the correct roof. But in the short run and the long run, it'll pay for itself, both the short run and the long run, because of lower insurance costs, especially associated with fire risk and hail damage.
Absolutely.
I agree completely on the Galvalume. This new Kynar painted panel, baked in color from the manufacturer, those over time do not look great.
No, they don't. A painted metal roof is not the same thing as a Galvalume roof. And mind you, guys, we're not talking about galvanized, the old stuff that was really shiny. We're talking about stuff that's basically got molten aluminum and zinc splatter coated on it. So it's got that kind of duller, shiny look that was developed so that the homeowner associations wouldn't go crazy with having overly reflective roofs. But the beautiful thing about a Galvalume roof, if it's installed correctly, the underside of it acts as a radiation barrier, which greatly reduces the heat that accumulates in your attic, which greatly increases the comfort of your home. My home with this roof that we're talking about, the attics have never gotten warmer than 90, maybe 92 degrees. It's not unusual to go up into the attic of a house with a darker colored shingle roof and have it be 140 to 150 degrees. That's a big difference. That's a big difference in the comfort of the living space below.
Especially if you mix that with a bunch of recessed cans.
And the reason why, when you have recessed cans penetrating that layer between the living space and the attic, and now that attic's 150 degrees, that heat's going down around that recessed can and infiltrating your house. And so is the humidity that comes with it, to say nothing of the dust and the dirt that accumulates in your attic. I know we're jumping around a bit, but that's one of the reasons why we developed about almost 40 years ago the challenge to the code requirement that said you have to ventilate attics. I came here from northeast of Dallas, this territory called New Jersey, and when I got here, I wondered, why do builders down here ventilate attics? It doesn't make sense. And the common thinking was to cool down the attic. You're not cooling down an attic by blowing air through it, no more than you could cool down a bowl of chili in the microwave oven by putting a fan on it. You can blow and blow and blow all you want on that chili, but so long as the microwave is bombarding it with radiation, you're never going to get anywhere. And that's why the idea of ventilating an attic makes no sense here. But the other thing about closing up the attic from the outside is then it doesn't get dusty and dirty on the inside. And then you don't get so much dust and dirt and molds and pollens accumulating in your house. So if you want a house that's cleaner and not as dusty, do a sealed attic.
That's a great suggestion.
Yeah, I know. There's all these connections. And the thing that is very interesting in the building business that I find fascinating is somebody has got to be that inspired generalist who helps all these subcontractors and specialists connect the dots between what they're talking about doing and the overall health of the home. Because a roofer is very concerned about making a house so it doesn't leak, and as well he should be. But the roof also should be done in such a way to make the house not heat up from the sun. It's not just a water umbrella, it's a shading umbrella. Now you're getting way beyond the realm of most roofers' understanding of physics and things. That's where the informed architect and builder come in and say, what? let's just install the roof in such a way that it really reduces the heat flow into the house.
Yeah.
Let's think twice about the type of underlayment you do underneath that metal roof, because some will help the roof dry out if it gets wet, and others will just trap moisture into the roof decking and make it prematurely rot. And then if you have someone come along who says, I've got a really good insulation system, this closed cell foam, I agree, it's great stuff, but you have to be careful with the way you install it, because you may be trapping moisture in the roof decking. If it's a metal roof here and closed cell foam there, that poor decking between the two has no way of drying out if it gets wet.
What's the underlayment that will hold moisture in?
Well, a lot of these synthetic underlayments don't let a roof system breathe. And I really do feel like you have to presume that eventually something's going to go wrong with the roof fasteners or the pipes that you're penetrating through the roof, such that it will leak. And if it does, you want to give the system a chance to dry out instead of accumulating moisture, and that sets up the conditions for mold and mildew and rot and then a collapse.
So what are you speccing then? I know we're getting very in the weeds, but
We are.
for like a for a metal roof system, what?
I still love 2 layers of 30-pound, well-rated, built felt.
The classic, been around forever.
It has been. It's called ASTM, the American Society of Testing Material Engineers, or something like that. 2 layers of 30-pound felt. When it gets wet, it really stops moisture from penetrating. When it dries out, it lets the substrate air out and dry out too. It's a very smart vapor. It's not a vapor barrier. It's a vapor retarder.
So are you not a fan of ice and water shield underneath a ventilated standing seam roof?
Forrest, I love ice and water shield at the vulnerable places.
In the valleys?
The valleys, the edge of the roof, maybe up at the ridge. But no, if you do it everywhere, you've put this big prophylactic around the roof, but just buy into my concept that eventually something's going to go wrong. And you want that roof decking, the plywood or the orientated strand board underneath it, to have a fighting chance to dry out. Because if you're going to be spraying foam to the underside of that ice and water shield covered roof,
Sandwiched in there.
you're sandwiching an organic material between 2 non-ventable materials. And you say, well, I'm going to build my house so perfectly that in 100 years there'll never be a leak. And I think you're just fooling yourself. That's why I like to have some escape route for vapor. And this gets back to the wall thing you brought up. I agree that the vapor here, the humidity here, comes from the outside 99% of the time. So we want to do the exterior of the house in such a way that it doesn't let that much humidity come in. It's a water shedding cladding system it starts off with, and then it's a good house wrap of some nature that stops the moisture from coming in, and then it's a closed cell foam on the inside that really stops humidity from coming in. But if all that fails, let it go all the way through the wall and get sucked out of the wall by the air conditioner, because that's really how it works. The air conditioner will suck the moisture out of the wall if it's moist. Have you ever prepared a meat? This is an analogy. Have you ever prepared good beef for a barbecue? You get it out of the container, you pat it dry. If you bought it at the store, you take it out of its plastic container, you pat it dry, you put it on a cookie sheet, and then you put it in the refrigerator. You put it in the refrigerator. Why? Well, you don't want the meat to rot, but also the refrigerator sucks the moisture out of the meat.
Oh, interesting. I haven't heard that before.
Sure, an air conditioner will suck. Mm-hmm. One of the jobs an air conditioner does is it makes it so that the air will dry out. You want the air to, any moisture that accumulates in the walls, you want it to be able to come through the wall and get sucked into the air conditioner, turned into condensation, and then drained out of the house. That's why you never want to put wallpaper on the interior surface of an exterior wall. That's why you don't want to put a mirror for your bathroom there, or something that's going to stop the vapor flow. You want that any moisture that accumulates inside that wall, they'll be able to get sucked all the way through and let the air conditioner do its job to dry it out. You don't want to paint you don't want to paint the interior surface of an exterior wall with a gloss paint or even a semi-gloss paint. Keep it at either eggshell, matte, or flat, because those sheens are not so strong that it holds vapor back.
I didn't realize that the paints actually were serving as a vapor barrier, and as the gloss went up, that it was more of a barrier.
Yes.
Fascinating.
Grasshopper. Really. Yes, there is definitely a vapor transmission issue that becomes more and more potentially problematic as the gloss level of the paint goes up.
Yeah, it makes total sense. I've just never heard that
Didn't
before.
you say that, didn't you say earlier about you peeled off the wallpaper
Yeah.
and saw all the mold? That's because the wallpaper was forming a vapor barrier.
I've always heard, too, when people paint brick, that you have to make sure you're using a paint or a lime wash that's also vapor open. I've heard that's also concerning, but...
You want a paint that will hold up to being able to stick to the brick. But I do like painting brick because that helps reduce its ability to absorb humidity and wetness from the outside. That's why when we're renovating a lot of our old 1960s ranch-style houses, we do paint the brick because that helps reduce the humidity accumulation inside the house.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is.
When you go to spec windows, what do you for a modern home like this that you know is going to have a ton of glass? I mean, are you going all the way to triple pane or?
No, it doesn't really benefit you that much to go to triple pane whatsoever. Let's talk about that for a minute. I think to talk about what type of insulation, what type of windows, what type of roof, you first have to ask yourself, what are the basics? How does heat transfer? That's a very basic thing. Because in essence, you're trying to stop the transfer or slow down the transfer of heat. That's what insulation does. But you really have to take a step back and say, okay, what are the means heat transfers? Well, the most effective way is through radiation. And if I use the kitchen as my analogy, you can heat up a bowl of chili in about a minute or two using the radiation put out by the microwave oven. Now, it's not exactly radiation as in radioactive stuff, but follow me along with this. It's a simple way of looking at it. You're bombarding the chili in such a way that the molecules get all excited and you heat it up pretty quickly. That's radiation. That's the most effective way of transferring heat. The next most effective way is conduction. It's when you transfer heat by one warm surface touches a colder surface. And are we having a problem with our...
I might have to grab that.
Trip's having fun. What's he chewing on?
I don't know. It sounds plasticky.
Do you want...
I think it's the tea again.
Can you just grab it out of his mouth, or do you want me to come do it?
He's holding on to that one.
Trip!
He said, "This is mine. I found it."
You want me to come get it?
Hang on.
Sometimes I smack him on his head. He is.
I just had to bring out
Hey!
the angry voice. Oh, there.
What are you doing?
Oh, he
So,
knows.
There's bones in here somewhere?
That's my boy. That's my boy. Have bone, we'll find it. Yeah, this dog is 6.5 years old and he acts like a puppy.
He looks young.
I know he does, and he's in fantastic shape, but he is remarkably immature and goofy. So you're going to be able to obviously edit this out. All right, it shouldn't work. But I do want to finish the kitchen analogy because I think that sets the stage for a lot of things. I'm sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. Little Trip intervention. All right, where were we?
We were talking about how heat transfers, and I was saying radiation is one very strong way of doing it. The next stronger way is conduction. That's putting the chili in a saucepan, putting it on the stovetop. The stovetop gets hot, whether by a gas flame or electric resistance coils or whatever. It gets hot, and that heat transfers by conduction up into the chili. It's the heat. If you have a warm hand and you touch your cooler part of your body, the heat transfers. That's conduction. And that's what R value is fighting. If you have some insulation between the warm object and the cool object, the transfer is not going to occur very well. And then the third way is convection, which is blowing hot air against something to warm it up. You can put that chili in the oven, and the convection oven can blow hot air against it and warm it up, but it'll take about 20 minutes. It'll take much longer than conduction, and that takes much longer than radiation. So you got those three means of transferring heat.
You forgot my favorite way of heating chili. I put it in my hands and...
You do. I bet you look pretty handsome when you do that when you get done. Do you rub it in your beard too?
Oh, yeah. I got to save it for later.
Good. I see that. Well, we'll go into that later.
Okay.
So anyway, the point is, in our climate, we don't really have the biggest problem to deal with is not how much different and how much hotter it is outside than inside, because it's only about a 20-degree temperature difference. If it's a really hot day and it's 95 degrees outside or 100 degrees outside and it's 75 degrees inside, that's a 20, 25-degree temperature swing, which is just enough to make you very uncomfortable, but it's not a whole lot. That's why we don't really need a lot of insulation here. It's not like we're in Minneapolis where it might be minus 20 outside and you're trying to warm up your house to 70 degrees. That's a 90-degree temperature difference, and there's where you really would benefit from insulation and therefore double pane or triple pane windows, because you're trying to keep that temperature difference at bay. But the problem here is not the temperature difference. It's the sun coming through the glass or the sun heating up the roof. So yes, you can go from a double pane to a triple pane window and get a little bit more of an insulation value, but the real problem is the sunlight coming right through the glass. It doesn't care what the R value is. So I would almost say that, gee, I'd rather have a fully shaded single pane window than an unshaded triple pane window. A fully shaded single pane window will operate more efficiently and give you better protection than an unshaded triple pane window in this climate, because the radiation goes right through the glass. Now, you can put coatings on the radiation to reduce it, but it's still going to go through the glass. And the analogy I've often drawn, and you've maybe seen in some of my talks, is if you and your spouse are going to the beach and you put a beach umbrella in the sand and she sits underneath the umbrella and she's completely in the shade, she doesn't have to put any sunscreen on, or very little. If you're sitting outside the umbrella, you better put a whole lot of sunscreen on and keep putting it on and keep putting it on. That's the coating on the glass. It mitigates the problem, but it doesn't solve it. If you shade the glass, it completely solves the problem of heat transfer. And that's the major reason why in climates where you air condition a lot, you really got to be careful about having any unshaded windows.
What are ways that you provide shade to windows? I mean, it's kind of a silly question,
3.
but I was thinking roof, landscape, what am I missing?
Well, 4 then. Roof, or an awning right above the window or door.
Which I guess would solve 2/3 of the window in a lot of the times.
Could be. It depends on if you're
outside.
doing your sun angle calculations and know how big an awning you need. But a rough rule of thumb, a very rough rule of thumb, is the awning needs to stick out half the length, half the height of the door or the window. So if it's a 10-foot high window, you need at least a 5-foot awning above it.
Which is a huge awning. I mean,
I know. And if it faces west, you're going to need even a bigger one. So you can do an awning, you can do an extension of your roof overhangs, you can plant some shrubs or make sure you keep some shrubs and trees available to shade the house. Or more and more with these floor-to-ceiling glass box houses, you have to put some type of solar shading device on the outside. And in a lot of our nicer homes, we put a rolling solar screen that comes out of a slit in the roof overhang and comes down over the glass. That's very effective because it's shading the glass. You see, you want to stop the sun before it hits the glass. That's why closing curtains on the inside of the house, it helps you a little bit, but the radiation's already hit the glass, heated it up, and come into the house. So the best thing to do is stop the radiation from hitting the glass in the first place. with some type of automatic solar screen or something like that. You have to do that. If you don't do that, the home will become uncomfortable and there will be a lot of glare. And after a while, people react to that by just never opening the curtains. And that's why if you look carefully at most of these apartments or high-rises being built around town, if they don't have the windows shaded, you'll notice the windows are whited out because the drapes are always staying closed or the blinds are always staying closed. And then the interior of the house is dark. And then what did you spend all this money on these windows for if you're not going to let the light in during the day because there's too much discomfort that comes with that?
Well, I've also noticed on some homes too that have a lot of direct sunlight and maybe natural wood floors, you'll pull back a rug that's been there for 10 years and the floors look totally different because the sun's just eating away at inside.
You know, I might take one of those. Do you have any of those Rambler drinks?
Yes, we do.
I might take one of those because I am getting thirsty. You know, and that's this issue goes to why, in many respects, the modern movement flies in the face of really comfortable design.
I feel like almost everything that goes into a modern house is kind of against a lot of what you should do when it comes to building science and building properly.
And there's actually, that's a great point. And why? Why do you think that is? The answer is architectural styles all evolved to reflect their particular environment. The steeply pitched roofs came about from northern houses, let's say northern European houses, where you had a lot of snow and you wanted to shed that snow off. The colonial house is a real enigma because people think of that as being the colonial style as being the traditional American style. Actually, it wasn't. It was a style sent to the colonies from the European powers that colonized those areas. That's why a lot of these houses with the steep pitch roofs and the very traditional looking things that really came from England don't really work that well in our climate because it wasn't a style that evolved for our climate. The only true American style is what we call the Craftsman or the airplane or the butterfly roof. The roofs, the houses that had broad overhangs at a fairly low pitch, so that you could have a 3 or 4 or 5 foot overhang above the windows and doors and protect them. A steeply pitched roof is really hard to have long overhangs because then they droop way down in front of the window. So, and then the homes that were built to look like they came from the Mediterranean area, well, the Mediterranean is drier and they didn't have lumber. The homes were built out of stone. So it was okay to maybe do a house without any overhangs from the perspective that it didn't rain very much, so we didn't have to protect the windows or the doors from the rain. And frankly, everything was made out of stone, so if it leaked, well, no big deal. Nothing would really rot.
Is the modern house a Southern California thing? No?
The modern house came about, it probably got most popularized in the 1930s in Germany.
Oh, interesting.
Where we as a society were really embracing technology. And we came up with something called the international style. The international style means it could be built anywhere. International because of forced air heating and forced air conditioning and the better sealants, we could build these boxes and put them in the North Pole or put them in the desert, and we could pump enough air conditioning or heat into it to still make it an okay box for you to live in. And then there was a whole movement to celebrate the international style. That's when high-rises started just becoming all glass because engineers could just pump enough air conditioning or heat into it to make it tolerable on the inside. But that doesn't mean it's naturally a comfortable style. It means it's a style that's only comfortable with the aid of lots of artificial inputs. If you wanted a building that's going to be comfortable, you want to think about, well, let's shade the windows. Let's make for some good cross ventilation. Maybe even put a tower in the middle of the house with some windows that you could open up so you create a thermal siphon to let air rise up and go out that high object in the center of the building or the house and open up the windows at the base, and then you can get a sense of convection currents and breezes inside the house.
There's a building at West Cave called the ELC on the board out there, and that's exactly Robert Jackson's the architect. We have that exact feature there. It's pretty cool.
It's called a thermal siphon. But you know what else is all over the place where you see that? The Texas Capitol or the any of the domed European churches. That was the air conditioning system. You have something that's high in the center of the building with an opening up there, and then you open up the windows at the base, and as the air comes in and warms up, it goes out the top.
Interesting.
And it creates a convection current.
I never realized that. So those domes are all vented at the top.
Yes. Yes. Now, when we went to air conditioning, a lot of them got closed. But that's why the dome came about. It wasn't just something that looked good. It was the cooling device for these buildings that would have lots of people in them.
My thought, and I obviously was wrong here, was I always understood that domes were just structurally very strong. You know, that arch shape is just a very structurally strong shape.
It is.
So in my head, I never really looked into it, but I always thought they did that a long time ago because it was the way in which they could build tall was by doing that shape. But I don't know if that's actually accurate.
Well,
or not.
that's how the vault came about. Yes, you could build churches with vaults because they'd all lean against each other and do a long vaulted thing, so you could get a tall.
That's different than the dome effect.
But the dome effect, the domes were primarily developed in Southern Europe to be a means of a big exhaust pipe for all the heat that would accumulate in the building.
Especially all the people in there.
Yes.
And the congregation,
Yes, a church might have 1,000 or quite a few hundred people during a summer morning service, so you would want the heat to be able to flush out. And you'd open up the windows at the base. Because remember, air conditioning didn't come into the picture in a popular manner until the 50s and 60s. I didn't grow up in a home with central air conditioning. I know you guys probably did, but I didn't. But anybody who builds a house in my hometown, which was Glen Rock, New Jersey, they all are air conditioned now. But before the days of air conditioning, we thought about where the prevailing breezes came from, and that's why the porches would always be on the south side of the house because they came from the south or the southeast up there, the Atlantic Ocean, just like they come from the south or the southeast down here, the Gulf of Mexico. So that's why the old houses always had the screened-in porches on that south or east or southeast corner of the house, and typically, the stairs would be on the opposite side of the house with some windows at the top of the stairs so the air could come through the house and up the stairs and go out and form this nice convection current. It's called the chimney effect. And it's neat. It works. It's the type of stuff we do with our houses that makes it so that if you have a hurricane and your power gets knocked out, you don't have to immediately find a hotel to move into. The house will naturally keep itself cool and comfortable. When we were doing homes for Alan Graham's Community First many years ago, that's out on the east side of Austin, we were able to show them how they could build these small homes that would get no warmer than about 81 or 82 degrees on a 104-degree day by incorporating radiant barriers and have the porch on the right side of the house and tell them, look, don't open up your windows during the day. Wait till the heat gets by, but then open up at night to create these convection currents inside the little building. And let's do a radiant barrier roof and radiant barrier walls. And you can naturally make it so that you could be relatively comfortable without air conditioning.
What are you doing for radiant barrier walls? Like a LumaFlash or something like that?
No, it doesn't have to be. It could be just Galvalume panels installed against the west and the east walls, but with an air gap between the back side of the panel and the house. Then keep the air, make it so air can come in the base and go out the top.
Interesting.
See, the beautiful thing about a radiant barrier is not that it's a reflector of heat. It's the low emitter of heat. So the outside surface can get quite hot, but because of this aluminized coating on the inside, a very small percentage of that heat transfers across the airspace to heat up the wall behind it. That's really what low-E glass is. Did you ever wonder about what low-E means?
It's starting to make sense now, but no, I didn't.
Low-E glass in our climate means if you've got two panes of glass, and this is the outside, the sun will heat up the outside pane, but because there is an aluminized coating that you can barely see on the inside surface of that outside pane of glass, very little of that heat transmits across the airspace to heat up the inside panel of glass. That's what they mean by a low emissivity coating. And up north, you turn that whole model around so the heat inside doesn't transfer across that airspace and go out.
Because you want to keep the heat in.
You want to keep the heat in. All that's good, but it's much better here is to just shade the glass in the first place.
So I'm curious, in the north, if you were designing a home with the same principles, would you, at that point, want direct sunlight on the windows?
Yes, that's where that term passive solar design came from, where if you size the overhang just right, because the sun's lower in the sky in the wintertime, it'll flood the house with solar radiation and warm up the house in November, December, January, February.
Yeah.
But then as the seasons go by and the sun moves up higher in the sky, because the overhang was sized right, it keeps the window in the shade. And that was the very basic fundamental principle of passive solar design. Shaded glass in the summer, full sunlight in the winter. And that's why you have to use a sun angle calculator or some tool to tell you what length overhang given the depth of the glass window and which way is it facing. A south-facing piece of glass is going to be much easier to shade in the summer because when the sun is up at noon, it's pretty high in the sky, so it doesn't take a big overhang to shade all the glass. It's about 80 degrees off the horizon. But as you come to the afternoon facing that way, the sun is down lower, and then it's really bombarding the glass. And so you need either a broader overhang or a porch or something to shade that glass. Now that leads to the way streets are laid out. In the older cities that were developed before air conditioning, most of the streets in the residential areas of the town would run east-west. Grasshopper, this is a great one. Why would the streets run east-west? Why would they have long blocks that go east-west instead of north-south?
Well, I guess if they're north-south, as the sun comes over, you're baking that east side of the house more? No, it would be the west side of the house.
Yeah. If you're going to be in a neighborhood, look at Old West Austin, where they're not really big lots. Most of your windows you want to have facing towards the street or facing towards your backyard. And you want to minimize your windows on your side of the yard because your neighbor's just right there 5 or 10 feet away. So presuming that most of your windows are going to be on the front and the back, then you want those windows predominantly to be facing south and north because you can control the amount of sunlight that hits the glass easily with south-facing windows. And on north-facing windows, you just don't get as much sunlight hitting them. That's why if you look at 6th Street, where my offices are, from Mopac all the way over to the east side of the town, you had all these long streets running east-west with skinny lots facing north and south. So you're always going to be more comfortable in a home where the majority of your windows face north and south as opposed to east and west.
That's fascinating.
And that's why, remember, these parts of towns that were developed before air conditioning really tried to work for the sun angles that way. And the fact that the prevailing breezes came from the south-southeast. That's why a lot of them, look carefully now, that have front porches if they're on the north side of the street, so you could sit out there in the evening and enjoy the breezes. And it's not really the air blowing off of the Gulf that generates a breeze. It's really a convection current. It's really the heat rising off the plains of North Texas because the sun bakes the ground during the day. The ground gets hot. It starts giving off its heat. Air rises up. And when the air rises up, it creates a vacuum that pulls the cooler air off the Gulf of Mexico. And that's why our breezes tend to come out of the south-southeast, which is where the Gulf of Mexico is. So it's not so much that it's being blown off the Gulf of Mexico, it's being sucked off of the plains of North Texas and Oklahoma, which I'm convinced that's where the expression came from that OU sucks.
Literally.
But no, yeah, boom. But seriously, it's just understanding the forces of nature and these convection currents. They can make for better ventilation in the house. That's why we put our swimming pools not on the north or west side of the house, but on the south or east side of the house, because they'll have more breezes. And here's something else that you'll get a kick out of. The breezes also give you another comfort-inducing factor. Mosquitoes don't like hanging out in a breeze. So you'll have fewer mosquitoes and bugs around you if your pool or your patio is facing towards the prevailing breezes. That's why the house you're doing for us, we put the pool where we did, because the breezes can come across it. So, there are all these nifty little subtleties about designing to respond to the forces of nature that I think the whole international movement kind of thumbed its nose at and said, no, none of that matters. People are just going to live in air-conditioned boxes. Mm-hmm. And then that brings about a whole nother series of problems. Mm-hmm. Increased respiratory illnesses, all sorts of other things, indoor air quality issues. No, we want a house that can be tight when you need to air condition it, but be kind of nice and open and breezy for the times of the year when it's not necessary for you to air condition.
Yeah, absolutely. I've always been a big fan of, and if I've always said it when I build a house for myself, I want to put a wraparound porch on it, and now I have all the science to back it up.
You do, but there's money involved in that decision, so we're judicious as to where we put the porch. Yeah. Put the porch where you're going to sit. Mm-hmm. Where you're going to sit is probably in a non-rectilinear space, but more of a square space. So I'd rather see you do a 12-foot porch in the front of your house that faces towards the breezes, and don't worry about ones on the sides of the house that you're never going to sit on anyway. Because a wraparound porch that's only 6 feet wide means that there's no space that's really comfortable to set furniture in.
Yeah.
But yes, the original Florida houses had those wraparound porches because they were trying to shade every single window.
Yeah, and just for rain protection on the windows and everything,
right.
It'd be
so
nice.
You could still keep the windows open during a rainstorm.
Yeah,
right.
I've also noticed too with a lot of like the really old historic Texas, houses that you'll see like in Johnson City. They have that little historic park, and they always have a dog run where it's shaded in the middle, and they always face southeast basically, mm-hmm. and so those winds
breeze
just
could blow through.
And they're so nice. I mean, I've sat on those actually just a few months ago. I was in Johnson City out there, and they have one there, and it was just 100 degrees out, and felt nice. You can sit right there in the shade. The breeze is flowing through, and
yep. But there is another reason why the dog runs.
What's that?
To separate the hot part of the house from the part of the house that you're going to try to sleep in.
All right, because they'd always do the kitchen on one side and the
kitchen, living, eating area on one side, the bedrooms on the other area. Noise protection too, but the heat of the kitchen would therefore not be able to migrate into the sleeping area.
Smart.
So that's where the dog run house came from, not just the ventilation, but separate the hot zones from the cool zones.
Yeah.
And we try to design that into our homes too. The hottest room in a house, the room that uses the most energy, is the kitchen. Mm-hmm. So that's why we try to put the stairway near the kitchen. Think about this. The heat that accumulates in the kitchen can go up the stairs and out some open windows and naturally ventilate the heat. You can use the windows in the stairwell, especially if it's facing north, to bring a lot of light, natural light, down into the kitchen to minimize your need for electric lighting in the kitchen. The kitchen's a very intense part of the home. Let's light it as much as we can naturally. Let's vent its heat as much as we can naturally. Mm-hmm. Then it starts getting into a real interesting science, but it's all called passive design principles. Passive heating, passive cooling, the collection of natural daylighting that's balanced, not just blasting in your face. And then the fourth thing is natural ventilation strategies. Those are the four principles of good passive design: heating, cooling, ventilation, and daylighting.
Yeah. I'm envisioning the interior of your home as you were describing that with your kitchen. You got the stairs right there, and yeah, it's great design.
And I do have a skylight in my house. It faces northeast. So in the morning, there's a lot of light that comes down and floods the center of the house, which is where the kitchen is, with light. And you can open up the windows at the top of the stairs and open up the sliding doors that go out to the screened-in porch and get a wonderful thermal siphon in the house.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, you've not been there during the day, but sometime come over and you'll see I built all that into it. And that's part and parcel to why it's probably still the highest rated green home ever in the history of the oldest green building program in America, which is Austin's Green Building Program. You can slap solar panels upon solar panels on the roof to make it efficient, but they will eventually break or not work. First and foremost, start off with a design that keeps itself cool and has lots of natural reflected light in the first place.
You throw one heck of a great holiday party every year, but I think you need to throw a summertime pool party so we can come see the other aspects of your house on showcase.
We'll keep them. But have we talked enough about I think it was a natural progression to go from the modern movement and where that came from and contrast it with designing to respond to the climate.
Yeah.
And that's probably a good place to wrap up, don't you think?
I think so. It was a great talk. Thank you again for coming on. It's always so informational. I feel like I learn a ton every time you do, and hopefully the folks home listening are also learning along with us.
I love it. You know, I'm at this point in my life, I like to spread this knowledge because I'd hate to see it, the DNA behind how we design our homes, utilizing these things, just go away. I'm fearful. I'm working with the University of Texas School of Architecture, trying to convince the new dean and those who make decisions there about the curriculum that they really would benefit the students well by bringing somebody in who could remind the students or teach the students about these passive design principles, because they are important.
Absolutely.
We can't always presume we're always going to have electricity readily available just when we want it. And if you don't make the house such that you can stay in it without electricity, then you've really affected what's called its resilience. Resilience is all about, will the structure still be usable after a major natural event? And that's why we like using metal roofs and other non-combustible exteriors. It minimizes it increases the chance of the house surviving a wildfire, as we saw in California. It's really just a lot of common sense things to make it so the house won't explode in heat. So all of the stuff relates.
Did you see that one house in the middle of the Palisades fire that was still standing, basically untouched?
Right, and there are those who say that's because it was a FIUS house, Passive House US. Yes, there are a lot of things about Passive House US. That's this organization that promotes utilizing some of these principles I talked about. But you don't have to spend an arm and a leg to make a house wildfire resistant. This one that's going to be on the Modern Home Store is very much wildfire resistant because there's very little natural materials on the outside that could ignite. And because we have things like a metal roof that embers might fall on them, but they're not going to ignite. And we've had synthetic window frames that have a very high combustibility rate. I mean, it takes an awful lot of bombardment with heat before they'll burn. We don't have wood windows. We have timber tech decking that could have all sorts of embers fall on it, but it won't ignite. So you just want to do common sense things to make it so the building doesn't ignite. Keep shrubs away from the perimeter of the building. On a lot of our better houses, we have about a 3-foot wide area of just gravel around the building, and then have the shrubs out there. Because if the shrubs aren't leaning against the building, they can't ignite and start the building on fire. But also, if the shrubs are not leaning against the building, you'll have fewer bugs coming in your building. So there are lots of reasons to do this type of designing with the natural forces of nature in mind. And that's probably a good place to stop.
Well, in there.
All
Thank
right.
you, Peter.
Thank you.